Alright, so my name's Anne Jones, and for my master's project I studied action repetition in 3 to 6 year olds. And I studied this at a free play daycare so that I could get a baseline understanding of the frequency, context, and structure of repetition. And there's very little repetition research aside from cases of psychopathology. So my hypotheses were largely based on Maria Montessori's work on repetition. So I hypothesized that I would see repetition in all children and that they display repetition across activities. And I also made a hypothesis about age because I was able to find one survey that suggested 47 months and younger would display more repetition than older children. And then I also made a hypothesis about the length of repetition. So I used Maria Montessori's classic cylinder block anecdote to guide my hypothesis, where she saw a young girl engage in 42 repetitions, and so I hypothesized that I would see repetition comparable to that length. And so I conducted 101 hours of natural observation in total, and during that time I would record action descriptions of the focal child. I had 31 children participate in my study. And after the action descriptions, I coded all of the actions and then used a VBA macro to extract all the repeating actions. And so for my results, here we have child on the x-axis and bouts permitted on the y-axis. And as predicted, all children did engage in repetition. And here I have event on the axis. So I called activity event. So we had undirected construction, fantasy play, animation, rough and tumble play, and then the y-axis has proportion. So it's the number of repetitive actions by total action for each event. And children did engage in repetition in all the events, but you can see that construction and animation had the most repetitive activity. And then here for my age hypothesis, I split up my repetition types because I thought that maybe younger children would be more interested in repeating things that involved learning skills about their own body. So motor repetition was any sort of locomotor or gross motor action that did involve an object. And then I had object manipulation repetition for anything that did involve an object. And I also split it by setting, indoor and outdoor, since these settings provide very different opportunities for action. So for the object manipulation repetition, there was no effective age for either indoor or outdoor setting. Whereas for motor repetition, the younger children engaged in more repetition than the older children, and that was the case for both indoor and outdoor settings. And then finally, looking at about length, I have length here on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, and you can see most of the repetition or bouts were 2 repetitions in length, and then the longest was 19 repetitions, but that didn't happen very often. So all of my hypotheses except for bout length were supported. So it does seem to be the case that repetition is a natural tendency among young children. And in the case where my hypothesis wasn't supported, I think there's a couple reasons for that. So one, I based it on the cylinder block anecdote, which I don't think was a prototypical example of repetition. And then the other thing is because I was at a free play daycare, it wasn't an environment that facilitated the deep concentration that may be required for those long repetitive bouts to happen.